I'm speaking today, has just gone over 51,000 records of novels, novellas, and short stories in Australian newspapers. And that's published between the mid-19th century and the mid-20th century for the most part. Today, I'm going to focus on the large-scale work of indexing that fiction. And more briefly, I'll discuss some of the literary historical findings that this indexing work has enabled for the 19th century. Sorry, there's some sort of timer on my slides, so they're changing of their own accord. So you'll get a few previews. So I'll talk about some of the literary historical findings that this indexing work has enabled for the 19th century. And then I'll conclude by saying some of the work we're doing at the moment with the 20th century newspapers. I've written a whole book on the findings, the literary historical findings for the 19th century, and it's available open access. So if you want to learn more about the specific things that this allowed us to know about Australian literary history and literature in Australia, then that book's there. So To Be Continued uses Trove's keyword search function, but in a different way to how literary researchers typically use these interfaces. So what you see here is a typical search box, and in the search I've put the name of a very famous author of 19th century British serial fiction, Mary Elizabeth Braddon, who was a sensation writer, the genre of sensation fiction. So this is exactly what I didn't do, sorry, to find authors. What I didn't do is search for authors or titles of fiction. And you might know why that isn't a good way of finding fiction, but I'll go through the problems anyway. So searching for the names of authors or titles of fiction would have left me, first of all, with lots of irrelevant results to exclude. So that's the results you get from just putting Mary Elizabeth Braddon in. And you can see that there's lots of obituaries. For titles, the list of irrelevant results could be even greater, especially if the title was a common word or phrase. You can just imagine how many irrelevant results that would find. More than simply being time-consuming, this approach to keyword searching would be largely self-perpetuating, as you'd only find the authors or titles you searched for, so those you expected to be present. And finally, the approach wouldn't accommodate the widespread anonymous and pseudonymous publication of fiction, even for really well-known authors like Braddon, or the changes in titles that occurred as the fiction was published and republished throughout the colonies. So this is a little, insider scoop on how this project changed once I started doing the work. So it was originally called To Be Continued because I thought that phrase would help me find fiction. And the reason I thought that is because To Be Continued appears at the end of lots of installments of serial fiction. Sorry, it's got a mind of itself tonight. So you get to the end of the story and it says To Be Continued, and I thought, oh, that'll be great, I'll find them. So I wrote a grant and I said, this is how we'll find them. And then I started doing the work and I quickly discovered I was completely wrong. So first, to and be and continued are very common words used in lots of contexts. And second, where they do appear together, where I'm interested in them, they come at the very end of the newspaper stories, whereas what Trove is privileging in its searches is the words that appear in the headings of articles. So instead of authors or titles or the phrase To Be Continued, the project finds fiction by searching for the words that commonly appear in the introductory paratext of fiction. And they include serial, story, our author, and here you've got Tales and Sketches, our novelist. But the most successful paratextual term, and the one that's found almost all of the 51,000 titles in the database, is chapter. You can see it there in the bottom too. And that's because it routinely appears at the start of fictional installments. So this is an approach I call the paratextual method. It harnesses the technology that was designed to direct human searching and reading for digital discovery. So it has the added advantage that in the process of digitizing newspapers for Trove, the headings of the articles are manually corrected with the aim of achieving a high level of accuracy. And that means that optical character recognition errors, which as I'll show you shortly are very common in the digitized newspapers, have much less impact on paratextual than textual contents. This paratextual method greatly increases the likelihood that the results of searches will be fiction, but we don't conduct it in the search interface. Instead, we use what's called an application programming interface. And that's a type of application or a bit of software that is designed for computer programs to speak to each other to share data. And using Trove's API allows us to harvest hundreds and thousands of results. And this is what an API record looks like. And you can see in some ways it's very structured. So for instance, you'll see there's an article ID at the top, and every article digitized by Trove is given a unique number. And this allows us to run a process that automatically removes any results we've previously harvested once we're going through and trying to find more fiction. Other usefully structured data includes the newspaper title and the details and the dates and pages. But in other ways, this data is very unstructured and requires extensive manual indexing. So one reason is because I've already suggested not all of the results are fiction. So for chapter, some of the commonly found irrelevant results are reports from chapters of Masonic lodges or religious organizations that have, chapters of a cathedral, as well as the surprisingly common genre in historical Australian newspapers called the chapter of accidents. And this is where really short descriptions of sometimes humorous, sometimes mundane, and sometimes horrific accidents are described. So I don't know why 19th century readers were so keen on reading about accidents, but they did seem to like them. So this record is fiction, and we can tell this by information in its heading field, which includes a title that sounds like it's a literary work, so Wynnum White's Wickedness, information about copyright, and a chapter number and title. So other headings might have just the chapter number, so just chapter V111. Or alternatively, they might have much more information than this one. So for instance, about where else the title is being published, descriptions of the story, so saying that it's sensational or original or tragic, or signature details are really common. And that's when it's recorded that this story is by the author of, and then they have a list of other titles. In either case, their inconsistency or the unstructured data requires manual work, and much of this is being done by bibliographer Carol Hetherington, who I was very, very fortunate to be able to hire as a result of funding for the project. So Carol's involvement was really, really fortunate because she was the director of AustLit, which is a database of Australian literature. And when I got the funding for this project in 2013, I emailed her and I said, "Oh, dear Carol, I wonder, have you trained any bibliographers in the past, 35 years you've been at AustLit that you could recommend for this work?" And I was very surprised and very pleased that Carol suggested that she do it. She was feeling like she wanted to move on from AustLit. So in the last couple of years, we've had a little bit more funding for the project and some more people have joined the team, and I'll say a bit more about the rest of the team shortly. So to do the work of excluding irrelevant records and identifying the works of fiction, we work with spreadsheets like this. So if that's making your eyes go crossed, then that's how we feel doing this data work. So the columns that I've colored blue, if you can see them, those are the ones that are the data Trove's API provides. So it's the heading field, like the one I just talked about, and the information we use for indexing. So the yellow fields are the ones that we fill in. So the only compulsory one that the spreadsheets absolutely need to be ingested is a trove ID, which is an ID we give to a title. So columns we use as needed. They're the chapter number and chapter title, and most records also have them. So we basically sort the spreadsheet in a range of ways to do this sort of work. And as you'll see here, this is an example where you can see that a number of the headings are for the same work, and we can see that they're all the man called Gilray, even though they're presented in slightly different ways, and they're all in the Daily Observer. So when we would do that data entry, we just sort of know it from the sheet that those were those stories. And you can see there that there's chapter 1X, which is 9, chapter 1V, which is 4, chapter XX111, which is 23. Sometimes these stories have, you know, hundreds of installments, and the manual work is grouping them all together. So all of those 51,000 titles or publications that I mentioned in at the start, most of them, going back, most of them contain multiple installments under the single title. So that's what the manual work is mainly doing, grouping together the serialized fiction. So this is an example here where the only records we have are the chapter numbers, and you can't tell from just looking at this what the story will be. So often we have to go into the records and actually look at the image of the newspaper page that has been digitized and try and work out if it's fiction or not. And if it's fiction, what story it belongs to. So I can tell here that A Long Journey is probably fiction, but I'd have to check. And I can tell that militarism in Germany and the Zabern affair is probably not. Okay, so here's the landing page of the To Be Continued database. There's a URL, so it's on the web. You can check it out and have a look. And this is the search interface. So you can see here with Crooked Company, as I've put in by Francis Marlowe, it's published more than once. So you can see 4 titles there so far. And sometimes it's published, not here, but sometimes it might appear in the same newspaper a decade or so apart. So if we're entering data and the story's already in there, we have to go into the database to check and that it's not already there. As long as it's not already there, we can enter the data. And we do this by putting in these fields. So the ones in red are compulsory. You must have an author, you must have a newspaper, and you must have a title. And the other fields we see to fill out are ways of connecting titles together. So common title is where we know that the story is published under one title, but it's called another title elsewhere. Attributed author name is where the author might be Mary Elizabeth Braddon, to use my previous example, but she's called M.E. Braddon or Miss Braddon or Mary E. Braddon or unattributed. So it's a way of getting a little bit of richer metadata. And there's some more metadata categories where we look at some additional fields. Is it a pseudonym? What are the other titles listed by the author? And then I've done quite a lot of work, if you want to ask me about it, on inscribed author nationality. So where the newspaper suggests the story comes from, or inscribed author gender, the gender of the author according to the newspaper, which might not match with the actual author. So this manual indexing produces a record like this, and you can see this is David Copperfield, you know, a famous serial fiction. And the obvious thing about this record is it jumps from chapter 3 to chapter 46. Yeah, I think 46. I get a bit hazy on my Roman numerals when it gets up there. So that brings me to the first of 2 things about this indexing work. Sorry, just go back. First, this whole project, so everything I've shown you, is open to anyone to participate. And it needs to be open to anyone because there's really so much fiction in the newspapers that we can't hope to get it all by ourselves. So you might have noticed some of the earlier screenshots had this community effort thing on it. So when the database was initially made public, we had some success getting people involved beyond academia. And we had a front page story on one of the main newspapers saying, hey, come and join up and index some fiction. And we got over 800 people to join up. And unfortunately, we weren't security conscious enough. So that's another digital humanities issue, which I'd never even thought of. And our website was attacked by a cyber attack seeking to get access to the university. And so we had to close it down and rebuild it. So our membership hasn't quite come back after that hacking effort. So we've still got some stalwarts with us though. And some members of the community add their own titles to the database. So researchers, so people who are PhD students or academics, tend to add stories relevant to their projects. And some of the projects currently being done with To Be Continued include one on Gothic and ghost fiction, and one on bushfire fiction, and one on fiction and drought. So members of the community, the general public, tend to add stories by authors they enjoy reading. For instance, a great deal of fiction by British author Agatha Christie has been added. So there's a fan in the community of that author. And local history enthusiasts often focus on the fiction in a particular newspaper. So we've had someone add all of the fiction from a feminist newspaper called The Dawn that was published in the 19th century. But more commonly, members of the public add chapters that are missing from existing stories. And to return to the case of David Copperfield, the way you could do this is you would look in Trove to find the other chapters of that story that are in that same newspaper, and then you would enter into that record and you would just take the unique article ID from the URL, and that's that number that's circled there. And you'd copy that, just Control-C, and then paste it into the Trove article ID for that title, and that would attach the record. So the other common thing people do is text correction. So that means finding a story they want to read and correct and accessing it in Trove's text correction interface. And you can see, I think, from the side there that the optical character recognition, and that's the sort of automated process that looks at a photograph and tries to work out, is that squiggle an S or a B? And that's what you get. You can see that it's pretty bad in some cases. So people can go through and correct the text of the OCR by looking at the page and writing the correct text on the left. And then they can draw that into the To Be Continued database. And that improves the accuracy of keyword searching in Trove newspapers and in TBC. And it also creates a fiction that people can read. So as To Be Continued has been increasingly used by others, it's made me aware of the importance of ensuring this indexing work isn't lost. And that brings me to the second thing that I've done with To Be Continued, which is to collaborate with the National Library of Australia so they can re-ingest data generated from their digitised newspapers back into their catalogue. So this involves a data mapping process where relevant fields in the To Be Continued database can be associated with relevant fields in the National Library's database. And now Trove harvests records every week that are in To Be Continued, and it draws it into its database. So that means that anything that is included in To Be Continued is then made available to everyone, but also retained, because I have a lot more faith in the National Library's ability to continue doing its work than I have in my ability, particularly with my hacking experience. So we call this the 360-degree data model for cultural data. And as far as I know, this is the first digital humanities project that is doing this cycle of drawing records out of, enriching them, and feeding them back into a National Library's collection. This is where, when you search in Trove now, for records that are in the To Be Continued database, they're listed as part of the library's catalogue. So here's an example of Red Money by Fergus Hume, where the 3 book editions are presented alongside 4 periodical editions of the story. And then if you click on the second set of records, the periodicals, you'll see that those 3 periodical editions are all in the To Be Continued database. And there's one from another source. There's an example of a record here where the story was only ever published in a newspaper. So the 5 editions we've found to date of Alfred Whitton's The Human Vampire of Norfolk by James Joseph Wright, who was probably Australia's most prolific novelist of the 19th century, and who the To Be Continued project discovered, and who never published outside of newspapers and never under his own name, but is now indexed in the National Library's catalogue. So if you want to hear some more stories of gnarly bibliographical work, or of the other types of fiction that we've been finding through the newspapers, you can go to this podcast that we've done about the fiction in To Be Continued. And every episode is a pair. So it's got one episode that is voice actors reading the stories from the newspapers, and the other episode is academics, PhD students being interviewed about what they know about this fiction. So if you go there, and it's available wherever you get your podcasts, sorry, I'm trying to go back to there, then you can hear about bushfire fiction or ghost fiction. There's one on children's fiction, there's one on modernity in the newspapers, and there's one on indexing. So check it out if you're interested. I'll just say a bit now about some of the findings from the 19th century newspapers, and that's what I focused on in the first stage, and that's what I wrote my book about. When I began, I thought that most, if not all, of the Australian fiction in Australian newspapers had already been recorded in AusLit, which is a really large bibliography of Australian literature. And I thought what I'd be doing is indexing the international fiction to provide the context for the Australian fiction that was published. But in fact, it turned out that there was a lot of Australian fiction that had not been recorded. And you can see here that includes a bit over 800 original Australian novels that hadn't been indexed. That essentially doubles the number of colonial Australian novels that are in our bibliographical records. Those 803 titles are works. So they might be published once, or they might be published 10 times or 50 times. What I'm going to be discussing is actually numbers of publications of witnesses of the fiction, because my primary interest is really in the circulation and reception of fiction. And for that, it's helpful to know publications as well as works. I'll also focus on what I call extended fiction, which is fiction that's published over more than one issue of a newspaper, or so serial fiction, or it is 10,000 words or more in a single edition. So unbelievably, some of these stories are 60,000 words or more in a single edition of a newspaper. Can you imagine reading 60,000 words just top to bottom of a newspaper? I certainly can't. So among these 9,000 titles that I'm going to discuss are unique fiction, reprints, a great deal of popular writing, and also works by international authors we would today call literary or canonical. It came from around the world, and while previously it was argued that Australian newspapers were dominated by British fiction, around 80% was the conservative estimate, our work found that in the 19th century, colonial literary culture was quite cosmopolitan. So of the titles we've been able to identify, around half are British. This is where we've been able to identify the author. And around a quarter of Australian, then a fifth American, and then 5% from other. So one of the reasons why we found more fiction and more Australian fiction was that To Be Continued Explore is focusing on indexing all newspapers that have been digitised, and that's not all newspapers. But previous indexing work had focused on metropolitan newspapers, so the really big city publications, which were assumed to be the primary arena for fiction. In fact, once we started, we discovered that the majority of extended fiction, so serialized, 98% of them, or some of them 10,000 words or more, were in provincial newspapers, which hadn't been indexed at all. And provincial newspapers not only published fiction, they did so in highly organised ways. So, sorry about this automatic switching. I must have some sort of mechanism turned on. Sorry about that. So they did so in highly organised ways. So it's relatively common with the metropolitan papers to find 2 or 3 or sometimes 4 publishing the same title. And when we considered the extended fiction in the provincial newspapers, this is what we found: multiple newspapers publishing the same title at the same time in the same sequence. And these are excerpts from network graphs, which indicate the thickness of the line indicates the number of titles that the newspapers share in common, and the closeness of the newspapers indicates how many of the same relationships they share with other newspapers in the network. So using these patterns as a starting point, we found 11 separate newspaper syndicates operating in the provincial press in the latter part of the 19th century, only one of which had been known about previously. And these syndicates operated across multiple colonies and could include 70 or more titles or 40 or more individual newspapers. And a number of these provincial newspaper syndicates published predominantly American fiction. And that was because the American fiction was free in the 19th century because America hadn't ratified an international copyright agreement. But many published predominantly Australian fiction at a scale that makes them, even individually, the most significant publishers of Australian writing in the 19th century and up to the latter part of the 20th century. So responsible for many more Australian stories than local or British book publishers. So these patterns of publication suggest reading communities that are quite different to what we've assumed to exist. So this is how literary historians previously understood literary culture in the colonies to operate as a metropolitan to provincial circuit. But what we found with the syndication networks was, in fact, that the Australasian provinces had their own largely separate literary culture that operated across colonial boundaries, so that people in the rural areas of the different colonies were reading the same stories as each other, in many cases, as well as in New Zealand. So this is where we're going in future. We're working on a publication platform to create a possibility for people to make their own editions of newspaper fiction. So that might mean creating editions of well-known or previously unknown literary works or authors, or it might mean choosing other approaches, such as collecting together excerpts on a theme, or even remixing materials from the newspapers with commentary or contemporary fiction. So we're still creating the platform, but we're interested to see what type of engagement people will do. The second way that the TBC is extending is by indexing 20th century fiction. So the original project was supposed to include 19th and 20th century fiction. So when I wrote that grant that was promising to look at international fiction in Australian newspapers, that using the phrase "to be continued," it was supposed to be across both centuries. But the original harvest that Carol and I did back in 2013 found so much 20th century fiction that we just abandoned the task. So the idea was there was supposed to be none because the rise of cheap paperbacks at the end of the 19th century killed off the newspaper novel. But in Australia, this isn't the case. So recently we've decided to tackle the 20th century, and that's required us to grow a bit. So here's the members of the team now. So Carol's still there. This is the new members. So Roger is an academic at James Cook University, and then we've got a whole great bunch of excellent PhD students working on the team. But even this enlarged team can barely cope with the scale of the fiction in the 20th century. So after 2.5 years, we've just finalised the results of a single search for chapter. And at present, we know very little about this 20th century Australian newspaper fiction, except that there's a lot of it. But there is an overall shape emerging. So this is a graph of all the publications of fiction, short and serialised, in Australian newspapers from 1855 to 1955. And to give you a sense of scale, left of the line is all the fiction I've been talking about for the 19th century, thought to be the entirety of what was in the Australian newspapers. But in fact, there's substantially more publications on the right-hand side. So double the number, in fact. And 3 times as many newspapers were involved in publishing fiction in the 20th century than the 19th. So even though they tended to publish fewer titles each, it's a larger and more distributed and common publishing phenomenon. Some early observations are that there's not only a substantial amount of fiction publishing in the first decade and a half of the 20th century, but it's very stable. It suggests an Australian newspaper fiction publishing industry that was bucking the trend of newspapers internationally, where at least we've been led to believe that literary and publishing, that fiction was in rapid decline in periodicals, if it was operating at all. It's clear to see the impact of the 2 world wars, during which time there were paper shortages to contend with, as well as social and economic disruption. And we've still got these 2 solid periods of production to explore. So what proportion of these stories will be by international, and what proportion by Australian authors? What proportion reprinted, what original syndicated, or will other publishing trends emerge? We find new Australian authors or unindexed stories by well-known authors, which we did for the 19th century. So that's what I'm looking forward to finding out in a project that is definitely living up to its name of being continued. Thank you very much. And I will stop presenting and will welcome any questions.
Thank you so much, Dr. Bode. We shall invite questions. Yes, Roy? Roy? Roy, do you have your question, or we will move to Dr. Chatterjee? Dr. Chatterjee, may we please have your question?
Yeah, thank you. Thank you for that excellent talk. I'm not a digital humanist, nor am I a bibliographer, but this is fascinating. I just wanted to ask 2 things. This is out of pure ignorance. One is, I suspect it's not part of your project, but if it is, are you looking or proposing to look at readership as well? Because obviously there's circulation, there's a market. But for instance, that 60,000 words or more, that boggles the mind. Who is reading these? And obviously there is a market, because otherwise there wouldn't be so many provincial newspapers. So just a thought.
Yeah, I'm very interested in readership. And for the 19th century, we actually have circulation figures of the different newspapers. So it's possible to get an idea of how large the audience was. There's also calculations that say that they think that on average for the metropolitan newspapers that it was 3 readers for every newspaper bought, and for the provincial ones it was something like 8. You know, they were sort of passed around a lot more. So yeah, I'm very interested in readership. I think it's never possible to really trust those sorts of numbers because those particular ones were created for advertisers. So they wanted to tell the advertisers, oh, look at these amazing circulations we have. So you're always sort of having to think about the context that your data might come from in that respect. But I think one of the ways that I've actually looked at readership is more focusing on the paratextual information. So you said that you weren't a bibliographer, and I certainly wasn't when I started this project. But one of the things I found really interesting was the way that doing the work of indexing, I would find out that an author was Australian, but the fiction would be something like a Maid of Hampstead Heath or something, you know, set in England by a famous but anonymous British author. So the paratext would be trying to sort of indicate it was British. Or alternatively, this happened a lot, that there was American fiction, which, as I said, was able to be published for free, and they would just change the title. So instead of saying, you know, an American detective in Russia, they'd say an Australian detective in Russia, and go through and change all of the... So what I was quite interested in was trying to think about how these sorts of indications in the paratext could be used to think about the model of the reader that the editors had. So the editor, their aim is to sell as many newspapers as they can, and often the fiction was one of the ways of selling the newspapers. So they had a model in their head of what their readership wanted, and they tried to construct it with these paratextual details. So I was interested in trying to think through notions of sort of modeled readership of the time. Yeah, so that's how I looked at readership. But yeah, thanks for the question.
Thank you so much, Dr. Chatterjee, for the question. Any other question? Please raise your hands or write it in the chat box.
Actually, can I just ask a quick follow-up?
Yes, sir, please.
Yeah. Just how, because the fact that American fiction was free, that just leads me to how strict were copyright laws in Australia at the time, given the fact that you know, there weren't the kinds of communication and copyright regimes that exist today.
Yeah, they were quite strict because it was a colonial government, so they were quite keen to defend British rights and laws. So definitely British copyright was quite at least respected by the letter, in that you see a lot of descriptions in the newspapers of, you know, this is the rights to publish this in the region of this area have been purchased from the, you know, these sorts of descriptions. For the American fiction, until 1898, it had no protections outside of the United States, and so it was published very freely. And so a lot of the, I guess I think of it as sort of incidental fiction. So a lot of the ones that are just like X inches, or, you know, they're trying to find a short story to fit in somewhere, a lot of that is American. That's one of the reasons why I was more interested in the extended fiction, because I was interested in trying to understand how fiction was sourced and circulated when it had to be sort of deliberately found rather than what turns up on the ship and then cut it out and keep it in the drawer. There's a project in North America working with the chronicling, it's called Chronicling America, I think. Oh no, it's called the Viral Text Project, working with Chronicling America, which is their newspaper database. And that's looked at the circulation of a lot of the short American fiction through their newspapers. And yeah, I've always thought it would be interesting, you know, someday to sort of think about how to connect together a whole bunch of national sorts of projects to try and think about the transnational circulation, and that might give more insight into copyright.
Thank you so much, Dr. Chatterjee, for the question. And Professor Bode, there is a question by Roy Matthew. I'm reading it out. It's in the chat box. Professor Bode, the first English daily newspaper was the Daily Courant, which presented different news stories of the same event in its issues. These were also cited. Readers could see how the same occurrence was covered by different reporters or periodicals. Similarly, your database has different papers' version of the same story. What can this feature be used for other than comparing the versions for format, wording differences, etc.?
That's an interesting newspaper being described about the news stories covered by different reporters. It's sort of like a 19th century aggregation engine that we have today. So the main thing that multiple publications show is circulation. So in fact, you would sort of wish that it would show something about the formatting and the wording differences, but in some cases the OCR is so terrible that unless it's manually corrected by someone, you can't do much stylistic analysis. So that's a sort of common digital humanities approach where you go through and you look at maybe how has it been edited and has this phrase been removed, and that sort of precise analysis. We can't do that with the uncorrected text. What we can do is consider how newspapers were, how fiction moved around the world. So, and moved from elsewhere into Australia, and once it was in Australia, moved within the colonies. So that means we can track something that comes in and it was first published maybe in maybe the Western Australian, so one of the metropolitan newspapers, and then it's picked up by one of the East Coast metropolitan papers, and they might have a little note about them purchasing it from the proprietors of the Western Australian. Then you can trace it moving into the provincial syndicates. So it's that sort of movement around and the insight that gives into the mechanisms of the newspaper fiction industry. So there are some really good stories among the fiction, but it's not easy to read because, you know, it's digitized, and like I said, some of them are, you know, these long stories, but also some of them are not very good. So yeah, most of my focus has been on considering how fiction moved and what it meant to people based on how it was published.
Thank you so much, Professor Bode. Thank you, Roy. Any more questions, please? Yes, Atul.
Hello, Professor Bode. Thank you so much for that talk. I had two questions. The first question is, when you began working on serialized fiction in Australian newspapers, did you have an original list to begin with, a preliminary list to begin with, as in these are the number of newspapers that we'll be looking at? Did you refer to some other work? Like, for example, people working on British periodicals would look at the Wellesley Index or the Pools list. So did you have like a master list of that sort to begin with? That is my first question. The second question is, when you work on such a database and create such an archive, are you also, as in, do you also train in the technical aspects of it? As in, do you also have to learn coding in order to archive such material, or is it done by, or do you have such specialized people in your team who do it? So thank you.
Thanks for those questions. So there was no index to start with. There was the Auslit bibliography, which had a record of the Australian fiction that was published in Australian newspapers. If you did if you searched around, no specialized list, but it was there within that as a subset of that database. But in fact, so, you know, I cited a lot of people when I wrote my original proposal saying, you know, all the fiction in Australian newspapers is known about, but we need to know about the international context. It's estimated that, you know, more than 80% of the fiction published was international, and we need this as, you know, context for understanding the Australian fiction that we've already recorded. So, yeah, I thought I sort of knew what was there, but then trying to work out how to search for fiction from all around the world, it wasn't realistic to sort of try and find multiple indexes. So that was when I came up with the idea of, you know, searching first to be continued, which didn't work, and then the paratextual details. Yeah, so that was how that began. In terms of coding, so until the project got some more funding in 2020, I was pretty much alone doing all of its technical stuff, but I had a small grant to hire a master's student to make the database with a sort of very basic interface. So what I've got now is much better than what was there for the first 9 years. And the reason it needed to be made better was security. You know, it's actually a quite sort of weird environment to be in, where, you know, little websites, because they might be on a university server, they can be quite, quite vulnerable. So I had to, get an expert to do it. Well, by an expert, one of my PhD students, you know, is an expert. So he rebuilt the database. In terms of coding, I mean, just in general terms, I tend to do most of the analysis work myself, but I tend to do that by just sort of learning on the job and learning very specifically. So I'm not particularly interested in technical stuff for its own sake. I'm really only interested in it for answering literary questions that I'm interested in. So with the network analysis, for instance, I was starting to notice that there was the same stories published all the time. And so it seemed obvious to sort of think about how this circulated in network terms. And so I just watched some tutorials on Gephi, which is an open access network analysis platform, which you have to use some command line sort of instructions and do the parameters and that sort of stuff. So that's the sort of thing I do. I just sort of get to the point where I know the sort of thing I want to ask a question about, and then I go and learn how to do it. And mostly there's open access sort of available things to do. And in fact, I'm actually now finding at least coding very much in sort of easier with using some of these not necessarily beneficial in other ways, generative AI platforms, which can really write code very well.
Thank you
Professor
so
Bode,
much. Thank you for that.
thank you so much, Atul. Professor Bode, if I may have a question, please. My question is regarding accessibility of these archives with regard to visually disabled students. So, considering the fact that there are a lot of like mistakes and errors because of OCR problems, how accessible are these archives to students who are disabled?
Yeah, that's a great question, and it's unfortunately not very accessible. It's accessible in the sense that if you were to go to the Trove database where the sort of digitized versions are, then they have a range of different formats to access it in. But you know, a lot of the screen readers would not be able to read this text because it's garbled text. So yeah, not accessible at all. Getting the crowdsourced corrections and doing the corrections in the team is one way of creating more accessible texts. And also the publishing platform we're building, which will also allow the editions to be exported in a range of formats and will be clean copies that will be able to be accessed through various screen readers, will also improve the accessibility. But yeah, with the terrible OCR, I mean, some of it's incomprehensible for sighted readers.
Thank you so much. Do we have any more questions? Yes, Akshata, please.
Thank you for that.
Akshata, you aren't very audible.
I'm sorry. Is this better?
Yes.
So, you talked about how serialized fiction stories, they would go on for really long, and they would not be readable as such. Like they would go on for, I don't know, a lot of years, I'm guessing. So I was wondering, when you put all of these chapters together and you have a complete sort of fiction from beginning to the end, do these plots, do they stay cohesive? Do they, in a sense, do certain thematic patterns emerge through these texts? And like, do these texts, in a sense, do you combine close reading with these archival methods when you have a text like that? That's what I mean.
Yeah, so that is, the question that was one of the ones that I asked when writing the book, which was how to look beyond the circulations and beyond the readerships and try and think about the contents of the fiction. In that respect, I was led very much by the limitations of the optical character recognition. So that means that certain methods that are quite common in traditional forms of digital humanities, and I mentioned stylistic analysis, so that's a lot of the ones that are used for things like authorship attribution. And what they'll want to do is, for instance, to look at very common words like prepositions and pronouns and use that as a pattern to try and identify who the author is. But that sort of stuff is completely impossible with texts where, some of them are quite good quality, but some of them, the OCR is very bad. So what I did instead was I used a method called topic modeling, which has the benefit of grouping words that are likely to appear in the same document across a corpus together. And one of the things that does as a sort of fortunate effect is it groups together all of the words that are OCR rubbish into a few categories, a few topics, and it allows some relatively clear topics to emerge. But one of the challenges of topic modeling, and I don't know if you've ever seen it, but they show you sort of clusters of words that appear together in clusters of documents. So it's either that they are completely obvious, so one is like crime, detective, blood, you know, and you're like, well, it's crime fiction, or they're completely opaque. So who knows what that's about. So the thing I did with that was I decided that I would get a decision tree, which is a method that they use for very complicated data sets in fields like ecology. So I asked the decision tree to try and connect these strange topics to the authorship of the stories. So I wanted to say, you're allowed to have two decisions, decision tree. Can you predict which is likely to be a story by a woman author? So it would say, okay, it has to have a very little amount of this topic and a very lot of this topic. And so then I used that as a way of directing my close reading. So I would then go to the stories that were shown as most having the largest amounts of the topic that was indicated as characteristic of writing by women. And I would read the stories and try and think, what is this bizarre, opaque topic and how does it relate to these stories? And in those respects, it was quite interesting because sometimes there might be a topic like nursery, mother, baby, that sort of stuff. And I'd think, oh, I know what this is. It's just domestic realism and, you know, this is the type of genre that women were writing in the 19th century. And then I'd go and read the stories that were indicating as having the most of that topic. And some of them would be domestic realism, as I had expected, but some of them were feminist sort of arguments against women having to be only in the nursery, only mothers and only for babies. So it taught me a nice lesson, I think, about how you can sort of use, like, one thing I think is that it's not like it's distant reading is far away and close reading is here and you're just zooming in on the same thing. In a way, you're sort of reforming what you have. And the corpus looked at through the topics is a completely different thing to the individual titles read. But it's a way of asking questions about the individual titles that can help to sort of connect them to the other fiction that's being published. Does that answer a question about close and distant, I hope?
Yes, yes. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Professor Bode. Now I would, are there any more questions? If not, we will move on to the vote of thanks.
Hello all. I would like to thank Professor Katherine Bode for this very insightful introduction to Australian newspaper fiction database. It was very useful. The history of compilation, the very many strategies of accessing it, and the ways it can be put to use. I'm pretty sure it will be useful in the handling of other databases as well. Thank you, Professor Katherine Bode. I would also like to thank IOE for graciously funding this lecture series. I would like to thank Professor Anna Kurian and Professor Pramod K. Nair, who are the coordinators of the lecture series and IWA Online. Also, I would like to thank Mr. Pranoy Rupani for tech support. I would like to thank everybody who joined our session via the Google Meet link and the YouTube link. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Have a good rest of your day. Bye, Manu.
Thank you very much.